Hello, everyone. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Today, we have a very special conversation with one of the most prolific and important, significant historians of modern Iran. But before we get to our conversation, I would like to, as always, thank our events coordinator, Ms. Becky Parnian, and our tech guru, Pete Nowak, for all their hard work on making these events possible. Also, as a way of talking about the logistics, I would first introduce our author and discussants, and we'll have a conversation after, and each of them would talk for 15 minutes or so. And then we'll have a short conversation amongst the three of us, and then I will open the screen for your questions. You can post your questions from the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and I would collect those questions and we'll pose the questions to Professor Cronin and our discussant, Dr. Milad Odabaei. This is, as I said, my great pleasure to have Stephanie Cronin with us today. Professor Cronin is Elahe Omidyar Mir Jalali Research Fellow at St. Anthony's College and is a member of the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. She has taught at the University of Cambridge and the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She is the author of many important books and also edited and co-edited a number of volumes that each of which had left a significant mark in the study of modern Iran and the Middle East. Among her books are Armies and State Building in Modern Middle East, Politics, Nationalism, and Military Reform, which came out in 2014. Shahs, Soldiers, and Subaltern in Iran, Opposition, Protest, and Revolt, which was published in 2010. Tribal Politics in Iran, Rural Conflict, and the New State, which also came out in 2006. The Army and the Creation of Pahlavi State in Iran in 1997. I can go on for a long time talking about her other publications, but I want to suffice to say that really I do believe that the study of history of modern Iran and by extension the Middle East, and as we will discuss today, looking at Iran from a transnational global perspective is really hard, the study of this field, without engagement with writings and contributions of Professor Cronin. And it's truly a pleasure to have Professor Cronin with us today to talk about this latest book. Let me see if I can get that into camera. Do you see the book written in? Okay, this is the. I don't know. I see on my screen. Yes. Okay, so this is good because the screen shows it backward, you know. But this is the latest contribution that our own Milad Odabaei, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center, and Milad joined us last year after a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the McGill University. At the center, Milad is working on his book manuscript called The Outside, a Translation and Iranian Travails of Learned Politics, which offers a historical and anthropological reflection on the translation of European social thought in post-revolutionary Iran. Milad received his PhD from the STEAM Department of Anthropology at the University of California in Berkeley, with an emphasis on critical theory and the significance of looking theoretically at anthropological fields. His research and teaching bring together critical and anthropological approaches to the study of translation and transmission of knowledge, as well as religion, politics, in theorizing modern Iran. Dr. Odabaei also have published a number of important pieces in contemporary comparative studies of South Asia, Africa and Middle East, How, Journal of Ethnographic Theory and Iranian Studies, and book chapters in important edited volumes, one of which is going to be published soon by University of Minnesota Press, called Spirit and Defiance, Ali Shariati in Translation. So without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Cronin to talk about the book, the main contributions of the book, and how the book came about. Because as I was reading the book, I realized that this is such an important summing up of the depth and the scope of Professor Cronin's intervention in the study of modern Iran and the Middle East. But I'd be curious to hear how the book came about from Professor Cronin, and how she thinks about the book after publication, because as we know, once the book is published, it has the life of its own, and we have this opportunity to hear the main highlights of the book from the author. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I must thank you first of all for such a generous introduction, and also the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for inviting me. It's a great opportunity for me to talk about the book. I think that the problem is, when the book is out, all you can see are the defects. This is the problem. All you can see is how you should have done something differently, or you got it wrong, or this is missing, or there's too much of that. So I hope the discussion won't be too harsh. But it was a book that I enjoyed writing. And as you say, in a way, it did allow me to travel back in time in terms of my own life, and look back at some of the influences on me. I should say, to begin with, this book began as a textbook. It began life as a textbook, partly because I have taught for many years now a paper at Oxford on the history from below of the Middle East and North Africa. And what I always found was missing was any kind of summary of social history from below, either for Iran or for the wider Middle East. We have some really excellent monographic literature now. I mean, the scholarship, the level, the quality of the scholarship being produced on subaltern studies, history from below of the Middle East and Iran is now really first class, but it remains monographic. We don't yet have kinds of books which would, if you like, give students a pathway in, because some of the monographic literature on history from below the very quality of it makes it a little bit intimidating for undergraduates and master's students. So what I started out by thinking I would try to do is to fill that gap, to write a book about the social history of Iran and the wider Middle East, which was accessible to maybe final year undergraduates and master's students in Middle Eastern studies. What I discovered as I began to think about how to organize this book and what material to use and so on, what I discovered really is that, especially when you look at Iran, there are many, many questions which are simply unanswered. This is partly, I think, a reflection of the difficulty with source material. And as everyone knows, source material, especially on the 19th century, is a little bit sparse and a little bit fragmentary. And it makes it difficult sometimes to try to work out what was going on. And the more I read around the subject, the more I came to the conclusion that one of the ways of approaching Iranian history was, if you like, from the outside. Instead of looking at Iran as a kind of island, we could look at it as profoundly influenced by what was going on around it, by other countries in the Middle East, and even by countries in Europe. So this is one way I thought we could begin to try to compensate for some of the difficulties in the Iranian case with source material, and some of the still early stages that we're at in looking at Iranian social history. We do have, of course, a lot of work done on political history. We have surveys and textbooks on political history, and sometimes they touch on social developments, but that's not their primary concern. So I think there was really a need for a look at how we can understand what was going on in Iran at a level below the elites. Of course, we know, we have for elite history and elite politics, we have plenty of material. It's not always so easily accessible, but it's there. But when you look at the 19th century, for example, you're faced with real difficulties about, as the famous article by Spivak said, "Can the subaltern speak?" How can you access these voices? So I decided to abandon the idea of a textbook and maybe come back to it later, but to try to investigate some of the possibilities for Iranian history that are raised when we take one of these other perspectives, as Professor Behruz mentioned, a global perspective or a transnational perspective. And I would like to add also a comparative perspective, because I think all three of these perspectives enable us to see Iran and its history and its politics in a different light. So I put together this book, which is, as I say, began life as a textbook, but it became really a series. The chapters in it are a series of experiments with this idea. Experiments, what can global history, what can transnational history, what can comparative history enable us to see in the Iranian case that we couldn't see before? So again, the book, excuse me, the book is not a chronological account. It's a thematic look. As I said, these are experiments, and each chapter plays with these ideas in a slightly different way. And I think it's the intention was to kind of open up possibilities for future research by introducing and deploying these perspectives in a more consistent and rigorous way. So that was one of the ideas which gives coherence to the book, I think, is this challenge that I wanted to offer to what is known as methodological nationalism. i.e. that's the idea that if you're interested in Iran, you look at Iran. And what's happening elsewhere is of little or no relevance. So, and this would be, there's any country the same. When you look at the UK, for example, you try to understand United Kingdom history by reference to its own limited past. So one of the ideas of the book was to challenge this notion of methodological nationalism. The other thing I wanted to do in the Iranian case, which I've done in previous books, but I think it is also a feature of this book, is to critique this idea of top-down modernization, as though what comes from the apex of the political system is really the only thing that is significant in the long term. And you even do here, even now, people will say that the 19th century and earlier, this is kind of pre-politics. It's not really politics, what happens in that period. And I wanted to show that it actually is politics, that even things that don't look like politics are deeply political. So I wanted also to look back and try to, if you like, rehabilitate this idea that it's not only what happens at the very top of institutions that has a long-term effect. And so in a way, that perhaps partly explains why the organization of the chapters in the book are a little bit unusual, because the book begins with a discussion of the 1979 revolution and then goes backwards to the 19th century. And I think the reason why I did this was because I think the 1979 revolution, more than any other event, can only be understood by reference to what was going on in the world and in the region in the 70s. And it's a good way, and in a way, it's a simple way of understanding how you can apply global perspectives, transnational perspectives to what's happening in Iran. Because it was particularly noticeable, I think, with the 40th anniversary of the revolution, that there's still this sense of puzzlement. People still find it hard to understand why there was a revolution at all and why it took the form it did. And so accounts tend to look at what is different about Iran to account for these events. But what I wanted to do is to look at what is similar between Iran and the rest of the world, which can explain these events, because I think it's much more productive. If you look at some of the explanations for the revolution, which do focus purely on the Iranian context, you see, I think, that there is inevitably this tendency to fall back on explanations of Iranian exceptionalism, that there is something different about Iran, which meant that it had this experience in the late 1970s. And that could be Shiism, it could be a kind of predilection for martyrdom, it could be the oppositional role of the ulama. All these things are put forward as explanations, and they have their part to play, definitely, there's no doubt about that. But they don't really provide you with an explanation of why Iran experienced this volcanic political eruption in the late 1970s. Again, people cite the Shah's repression, the corruption, the oil price rise and the petrodollar waterfall that hit Iran and all these things. You add them all together and they still don't explain the revolution. And the revolution, I think we should remember that the revolution in Iran was a real revolution, and real revolutions are very rare. When you look back at the Middle East, you can see all sorts of turmoil, coups, uprisings, all sorts of things. But revolutions, in the sense of what happened in Iran in the late 1970s, are very, very rare. So I think we can look back and we see very few examples. And I think one of the reasons why the comparative approach is quite useful here is because the model that people had in their minds as the revolutionary process was unfolding was the example of the Russian Revolution. This is how people in the 20th century thought about revolutions. If you said the word revolution, it almost brought with it the word Russian. And I think that looking at this can explain some of the, what with hindsight, we can recognize as mistakes that were made by political forces who did not support Khomeini, except in the transitional sense. Because for many people who were active in the revolution, the return of Khomeini was a kind of, there was going to be a period of dual power, as there had been between the February and October revolutions in Russia. And then there would be the resolution of this conflict with the establishment of a socialist republic. And if you would like to see an example of this kind of thinking, then just look at the last pages of Fred Halliday's book on Iran, in which he says pretty much that sort of thing. Of course, the Russian Revolution is not a kind of program which could be adopted in Iran. And Kerensky was not Khomeini was not a Kerensky, and he was not, I mean, on the contrary, he turned out to be a figure of political significance that no one had anticipated. So I think, you think about in what sense is the Iranian Revolution like the Russian Revolution, and in what sense it's different. And the thing that it throws up, of course, is that the other big difference is that there was no war in the Iranian case. Revolutions often come out of wars. This was the case with the Russian Revolution. It was the case with the other famous example that Iranian leftists around the world had, which is of the Paris Commune, which also came out of war in 1871 in France. So again, the comparative approach, I think, makes you appreciate how important the comparative dimension was in terms of people's consciousness, but also how the Iranian Revolution did not follow the same trajectory as the Russian Revolution did, and you can ask yourself why. And so it can develop in quite an interesting direction. So you can use I think, and that's what I did in the chapter on the 1970s. You can use the comparative perspective. You can also use the global perspective, because what is happening in Iran between the Second World War and the 1970s is very much the same as what is happening in other countries around the world. And I'll give you two examples. One of these is what's called the education revolution. Everywhere, I think, I can think of no exceptions. Maybe there are exceptions, I can't think of any, but everywhere around the world, every government introduced this program of mass tertiary education. Governments of right and left and independent and post-colonial, every kind of government you can imagine wanted an educated population. So you see this massive expansion in university education, and it produces a generation of students who are educated, but politically frustrated and dissatisfied with the options which are available to them, which they feel should be better given their education. So you have in practically every country around the world, you have what you had in Iran, which is the development of this generation, which is well educated and politically radical. And you can see, we had again another anniversary, the anniversary of 1968 in Paris. And it's now possible, of course, we see 1968, this is a global phenomenon. In Europe, we think about Paris, but you can also think around the world, in Africa, in Latin America. 1968 was also a key year. So I think, one of the ways of looking at the global perspective for the Iranian Revolution is to look at things like this education revolution. The other example I would give of this global, the utility of this global perspective, the turn to armed struggle in the 1970s. Again, this was a global phenomenon, and it resulted in every country from similar causes. You have in every country the increasingly conservative nature of communist parties, You have the de-Stalinization of Khrushchev's speech, doubts about the Soviet Union, Hungary in 1956, the Sino-Soviet split, and a vogue for Maoism. This is what you have in Iran, but you have it in every other country as well. And looking at the way these political events played out does shed, I think, a very significant light on what was going on in Iran. Again, briefly, the transnational dimension is very obvious in the Iranian case. Iran was surrounded by revolutions in the 1970s. You have Dhofar in Oman, you have the People's Democratic Party in Afghanistan, you have revolutions lapping at the shores of Iran throughout the 1970s. And it provided naturally a destination for Iranian radicals to go to and learn from. And so these, again, this has been studied to some extent. We know that the Iranian leftists and radicals would go to Dhofar, they might go to the Palestinian camps. And then again, there was travel between Europe and the Middle East, which also explodes in this period. In the 1960s, travel becomes cheap. People can travel, and they do. And traveling around the Middle East changes people's perspective. And we see also that people go to Vietnam and they go to North Korea as well, and they start to go to China, and they get a different sense of what the world is like. Of course, they go to America and Europe, but they don't only go to America and Europe. And that is, I think, what's interesting. So I think the revolution and the 70s in general gives us an opportunity to use these perspectives quite productively. And so I thought, if I begin with this chapter, then it perhaps makes clearer what I'm trying to do in the subsequent chapters. And as I said, each of the subsequent chapters is really a kind of experiment, and they have their different ways of approaching this. And what I did with the next chapter, which is on bread protests, was again to see how scholarship on these sorts of phenomena could be used to help us understand what was happening in the Iranian case. And so I took as a kind of text for the day was E.V. Thompson's article on the moral economy of the English crowd, which was an absolutely seminal development in social history. And everyone acknowledges this article now when they talk about price rises, bread protests, you know, even with when there is the removal of subsidies as a result of political pressure in countries and there is a reaction, it also recalls Thompson's article. But when you read that article, you go back to it, because it's about 50 years old now, you go back to it, you see how subtle it is. And one of the things it enabled me to do in the article on bread riots is to think about legitimacy. Because as I said, subalterns in the 19th century and earlier are generally considered to be pre-political. That is, they don't have a kind of conscious program or a wider understanding. What Thompson says is that actually there is a sense of legitimacy among rioters and protesters, and it comes from real sources. In the English case, he says it comes from statutory legislation to control markets that existed in earlier periods under the Tudors and Stuarts. So I looked at the Iranian case and I thought, there are a lot of bread riots in the 19th century. There's a lot of famine. No, the most famous famine in the early 1870s, but it wasn't the only one by any means. So there was a constant kind of crisis about food, and there were reactions. So where did the protesters get their sense of legitimacy from? And I became interested in that because Thompson had been able to point to sources of legitimacy in the English case. So I looked at this in the Iranian case, and you can, of course, find sources of legitimacy. And one of the principal places for legitimacy is, of course, religion. And when you look at the writings of scholars, of religious scholars at the fiqh, and you look at the Hizbah manuals that were produced for muhtasebs to maintain order in the cities, you see that they're clearly opposed to market speculation and maximization of profit. This is wrong in religious terms. It's a source of legitimacy. There are other sources of legitimacy that would have been available to non-elite actors in the 19th century. Mirror for Princes literature. Again, it says that one of the principal duties of the ruler is to guarantee the supply of bread to the population. That's why they owe him taxes. If he can't do this, they're entitled not to give him their legitimacy. So again, you have the idea of the circle of justice, which is the same sort of thing. Ordinary people have the obligation to be loyal to the ruler, but the ruler has the obligation to guarantee the supply of bread. And this is, again, a common idea. And these ideas, again, they're in the Shahnameh, and they would have been very familiar to people. So I think what looking at Thompson's article enabled me to do, I hope, I don't know how successfully, but I hope, is to look at the same sorts of issues and try to understand how they worked out, how they played themselves out in the Iranian context. I don't want to overshoot my time. Do I have some more time?
I want to make sure that we give Milad some time to raise some questions, but
just 5 minutes.
Yeah, a couple of more minutes, and then we move on to
as usual, I misjudged the time.
That's all right. We are enjoying your
So again, in chapter 3, which looks at the dark side of modernism, again, I wanted to look around and see what had been done in terms of the impact of modernism around the Middle East and in Europe. And I tried again to apply some of the findings of that research into the Iranian case. And I think it did, when I tried to do this, one of the things that surprised me about it was the scope of the ambitions of the modernist regimes. I mean, they really wanted to change people, not just, it wasn't just a question of building an army and a bureaucracy and a few reforms. They wanted to create a new man, and it was usually a man. This is, again, a Soviet idea, the new Soviet man. And I think in Iran too, there was this desire to create a new Iranian man. And then if you did that, you would automatically somehow, an Iranian woman would follow on. But it was a revolutionary program, I think, in a way. And it involved much more than the usual things that are cited as the kind of reforms of Reza Shah. It was much, much more ambitious than that. Two articles that come after that on slavery and banditry in the Middle East and North Africa, and looking again at the Iranian case. I, again, took some key texts, Eric Hobsbawm's book on banditry and Edward Said's Orientalism, and tried to use these again to engage with the literature and the historical and historiographical and methodological issues. And finally, the article on anti-veiling campaigns, which again, I think it gives us a picture when you look at the range of anti-veiling campaigns in the Middle East in the interwar period, then what happened in Iran in the mid-1930s ceases to look so unusual or so hard to understand, and simply becomes another manifestation of Iran joining the struggle for the global struggle for modernism. I will stop there, although I have plenty more to say.
Thank you so much. I truly think that every single chapter of the book requires a separate conversation, because there is just so much in each chapter, and it's very difficult to sum up all the ideas there in a single conversation. But again, for the sake of time and because we want to make sure that we can end at the end of the hour, I'm going to give the screen to Milad, and then we can have a conversation after Milad's comments. Milad.
Thank you, Behrooz, and welcome, Professor Cronin. It's been a pleasure to spend time with your impressive and important book. I'm still very much thinking through it, and I am very thankful that we have you today in helping us do that. Let me also acknowledge Becky Parnian, Pete Novak, and Femke de Ruyter, who are working behind the scene to make this event possible. Social Histories of Iran is a novel and important addition to the field, as it puts the experience of subaltern social groups at the center of the history and historiography of modernity in and beyond Iran. This is the history of those subjected to crises born in the wake of changing socioeconomic, political, and economic paradigm and religious paradigms, and to modernism's politics of representation on the other. Telling it, Cronin provincializes the history of the elite and their ideologies of state and society. In what is the book's second and decisively methodological intervention, which we heard about, the Iranian experience is situated in the experience of the modern Middle East and the world, pushing against a tendency that the introduction identifies as methodological nationalism. This is, quote, the assumption that the geographical territory defined by the state and the population within its borders is the primary and sometimes only organizing principle of research and analysis, end quote. The book embodies a global, transnational, and comparative approach that rejects, quote, any singularity or uniqueness to the experience of individual countries, but seeing it as fundamentally shaped by inescapable transnational and global developments, end quote. This is a methodological intervention with broad ramifications beyond the discipline of history or Iranian studies. And therefore, I would like to spend some time thinking through the method and consider the ways in which these three components, the global, transnational, and comparative, sit together. I have two overarching questions. First, I'm wondering, to what extent are the global and transnational part of the same interpretive paradigm and political world as the national, and are therefore unable to move us beyond methodological nationalism? And second, on what are the grounds of comparison? On the one hand, the book draws on landmark works of Marxian historians E.P. Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm, as well as Michel Foucault, to develop the global world that Iranian history unfolds out of. These are primarily historical studies of modern Europe, but in the book provide the meta-historical paradigms of global comparison that allow the text to establish equivalences between the experience of Iran and other contexts. There's also original theorizing of the global. For example, as we heard in chapter 1, the brewing of the Iranian Revolution in the context is theorized in the context of a global education revolution and the rise of the left as a transnational formation. And the book situates the rise of the Islamic Republic in relationship to the 1980s turn to conservative and neoliberal politics. On the other, and despite the explicit rejection of singularity to any context, comparison in the book does not always establish equivalences. The most explicit example of what I want to call a move towards singular discursive formations is the 5th chapter's history of slavery in the Middle East. Here, the analysis pushes against the generic understanding of slavery and shows it to be based on the universalization and globalization of modern plantation slavery in Americas. Unlike the case of Iranian revolutionaries, bread protesters, and bandits, Cronin elaborates on the experience of slavery in the Middle East in contradistinction with the dominant Western understanding of the subject. The emphasis on, quote, the slaves' own experience, end quote, brings to focus social relations that situate slavery in a distinct space of experience and horizon of expectation, emphasizing that the possibilities confronted by the slaves in the Middle East and Americas were different. Cronin suggests that it would be an error of historical interpretation to adopt a universally applicable ideas of revolt and abolition. The book does not explicitly theorize this error in relationship to liberal and secular epistemology of European historiography, but it is nonetheless explicit that the liberal and secular conceptions of the subject, agency, equality, and freedom internal to the Western history of slavery were absent or not yet present as existing social relationship in the Middle East. There are other cases that can be highlighted as historical exposition of distinct social relationship, such as Muhtaseb, who puts limit on a speculation and regulated the pre-modern Middle Eastern markets, illustrating a synthesis of Islam and political authority in the Qajar state that stands in contrast to 20th century conceptions of Islamic revolution and the state. In a way that Mauna Kea's recent history of the Persianate paradigms of belonging exemplifies, this kind of historical problematization could comparatively push against methodological nationalism without resorting to the global as a concept, a heuristic, or an ideology. As feminist scholars such as Marilyn Strathern and Judith Butler have argued in relationship to categories of sex and gender, concepts of analysis are part of social relations and are at best partially legible outside of those relations. This is why post-colonial scholars argue that the concepts and methods of the global often reconstitutes the horizon of universality in the image of European experience of modernity. This is also why the reason why scholars of earlier universalisms, such as Sheldon Pollack or Sanjay Subramanian, emphasize transnational connections over the global as a given feature of the historical process. There is an echo of the limit of historical interpretation in Cronin's use of the comparative method, particularly when it gets close to the social experiences and foreign terms of its negotiations, such as Muhtaseb. My sense is that the framing of subaltern groups against the elite and various localism does not allow comparison to be explicit about the normative commitments of global history. Samuel Moyne and Andrew Sartori note that the global wears the trace of universal history in a Hegelian mode, even if in a Marxist key. An example of this is Antonio Negri and Michael Hart's Empire, where subalterns of the world unite as subjects of global capitalism. Max Weber and Michel Foucault's historically attuned studies of capitalism and neoliberalism show these global formations as local and provincial productions. Post-colonial theorists, Chakrabarty and Talal Asad, for example, elaborate on liberal and secular historiographic and language ideologies that, in parallel to the global market of commodities, establish equivalences between various experiences of time and history. For as Marx noted in the manifesto, as the national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness becomes more and more impossible under global capitalism, there emerges a bourgeois cosmopolis. Quote, from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature, end quote. The global is a discourse produced and circulated within Euro-American academic institutions and public forums, including Iranian studies. How then might we think about Iran without producing a nativism of methodological nationalism and methodological globalism, particularities masquerading as universals? On page 2, Cronin notes a persistent Eurocentrism in global, transnational, and comparative histories. The book generously pushes against this kind of Eurocentrism by elaborating on the experience of Iran and the Middle East. There's also another and growing body of global scholarship that frames the Iranian experience of modernity as one of subalternity. For the decolonial scholars in this corner of the global turn, the experiences of colonialism, imperialism, foreign interventions, wars, and sanctions render Iran as part of the global formation of marginality that is sometimes glossed as the third world or the global south. In this frame, popular elite, such as Jalal al-Ahmad or Ali Shariati, are not framed in contrast to local subaltern groups, but local voices of global subalternity. As a result, the Iranian revolution and the state are illuminated not as manifestations of global revolutionary and fundamentalist politics, but as subaltern responses to Euro-American domination of global society. What I'm emphasizing, however, excuse me, is neither the epistemological and nor political Eurocentrism of global historiography that can be remedied in post-colonial or decolonial terms. I am emphasizing the historical specificity of experience and sociality of knowledge and politics that animates our global discourse. Perhaps we might want to hold on to the language of singularity to describe this specificity, or describe the global asymmetries and inequalities of, for example, British colonialism, American imperialism, or even Iranian nationalism. For those that we situate globally and recognize as nationalist, nativist, or fundamentalist, occupied a social situation and discursive fields that, much like the Middle Eastern slaves of chapter 5, determined their possibilities of thought and action. And I want to end with a non-methodological question. Our conversation has been focused on method. And this question is, how do we situate the transnational clerical establishment and the Shia formation of community in relationship to modernism and marginality? There's a sense in the book that the nationally organized bourgeois elites, a historically novel group, participated in the social construction of subaltern groups. Late 19th and early 20th century clerical elites were not new and were not nationally organized. We know, for example, of the significance of Najaf-based clerics in the constitutional revolution. Clerics were also sustained by a non-market economy of religious duties and served as a reference for conduct for lay Shi'i through the doctrine of emulation, taqlid. How would we historically describe the Shi'i formation of community or describe the transnational nature of clerical authority in terms of modernism and marginality? Were I to derive a heuristic from the book, I worried that I would have to divide the community in terms of lay subalterns or learned clerics, or see the community as a whole, as a subaltern group, the way that Shariati and Khomeini, for example, saw it and sought to refashion it as part of a global revolution against the state. Thank you.
Well, both presentations, there's so much there to talk about, and here I promise that we are going to reconvene to continue this conversation, because I think Milad raises a number of important methodological questions, and I'm sure that in the time we have left for 10 minutes, we can't do justice to these questions. And I'm going to just give the screen to Professor Cronin again, but I just want to add one little thing to what Milad already articulated, and that's the, we talk about global transnational comparative, and of course then now there is another sort of new dimension of the conversation on the planetary understanding, and that I think actually opens up a whole new ways of thinking and possibly addressing some of Milad's concerns about this kind of ambiguous relationship between the global and national, and transnational and national. How do we make sense of all this in planetary terms? And I've been asked to write a piece for a Persian journal in Iran and on the recent unrests and in Khuzestan, and I was thinking that this is kind of an interesting example of thinking in terms of planetary connections about putting like the oil workers and workers in sugar plantation and the question of water and how these things are internally so connected, not only in terms of policies, labor practices, and this and that, but also in planetary terms. That a situation that we live under Anthropocene or Capitalocene that we all share around the world in terms of water, energy, air, and so on and so forth. And of course, that's again, that's a whole new kind of conversation. But at some point, I think it possibly would be a very productive conversation to situate global transnational comparative in the broader frame of the planetary and see what we get when we look at these questions of national histories. So let me ask Stephanie to jump back in and in 10 minutes solve all our problems. And if not, then we are forced to ask you to come back and continue the conversation another time.
Thank you. Your remarks about the planetary remind me of some early Soviet science fiction that I read a while ago. And one of the preoccupations of this science fiction was the difficulties of building socialism on one planet, which is, clearly an echo of what you said. I think Milad's intervention was very interesting, and I think he makes a number of points which need to be discussed seriously. I don't want to say too much at the moment because I need to think about it. I'm not entirely happy with the language that we use when we approach this kind of social history. The idea of the subaltern was, of course, an invention of South Asian studies because they were faced with the reality of a country which was largely rural, which there was very little in terms of working class. And so they needed another way of talking about people who were not members of the elites without using the terms familiar from European social democracy. So this idea of the subaltern seemed to do that because it avoided the question of where the working class was. And it also clearly differentiated these groups from elites. But of course, it's a very vague word. Who is a subaltern? What sort of hierarchy does this create? In classical European social democracy, the idea of the working class were people who had only their labor to sell, and they were not part of the exploiting class. When you look at the subalterns can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And it does raise the question of when you look at groups who are excluded from power, such as the examples that Milad gave, how do we talk about them? Kind of really, I think it's stretching things to describe the transnational Shia networks as subaltern. It doesn't really work. so we have the question of subaltern status. We have also the question of marginality. And then, again, they're not necessarily the same thing. So I think the language sometimes lends itself to a certain vagueness and lack of precision that wasn't present when leftists used to talk in terms of class. Class is a much clearer way of understanding these things, in my opinion, but it's been largely abandoned in favor of these other sorts of categories. And it does give rise to, I think, a lot of problems. I don't think I actually want to say much more at this stage, if we have any audience.
We do have a question on the categories of the poor, and I think it's related to what you were just talking about, and how do we relate this concept of the poor and how we, in sociological lingo, operationalize it in our research, and then we create these different categories. For example, this is a question there that like we say, prostitute and a beggar as marginalized classes, as dangerous classes. And but in practice, we see that there is so much overlap between these categories. How rigid are these categories? Because you do talk about dangerous classes, and are you using, for example, that term dangerous class as a class in a sense that is a sort of a rigid classification of a group of people, or this is just a general sort of assertion about different groups of people and there is no rigidity around these concepts?
The term the dangerous classes actually comes from a book that was written in France in the early 19th century, and that book coined this term, the dangerous classes. So I think it's a kind of it summarizes the kind of fears that were nurtured by the rising bourgeoisies about these sorts of elements. So again, it isn't a particularly precise term, but on the other hand, we all know who we're talking about. So I think, again, with these sorts of categories, it's not really necessary to have sharp divisions. You could have women who were sex workers, but were not subaltern. They could have been extremely well off. You know, we have the example like of the singer, Maharaj. What is she? You know, this is one of the problems. Marginal? Not really. Subaltern? Not really. But she does represent something which is a challenge to the kind of conventional bourgeois order. So in a sense, I think you can play with the language, but this is not a scientific exercise. You know, there is a lot of overlap, there is a lot of intermingling. People can be one thing one day, you know, you can be a sex worker for the first 10 years of your adult life and then become respectable. You know, so this is not like class in, as I said, in the sense of European social democracy, where class was clearly defined. You either were a member of the working class or you were not. This is not like that. It's much more fluid, and I think it probably captures the reality of societies, particularly societies which are not very fully industrialized. It probably captures the reality better than trying to kind of impose rigid categories onto people.
So let me ask you this question. When are you coming back to continue this conversation? Because I'm afraid we are running out of time, surprisingly, that this 1 hour passed by so quickly. And I genuinely want to thank you for taking the time and having this conversation with us. And Milad, thank you so much for your comments. After these conversations at the center, we all get back together and have a nice lunch and continue the conversation offline. And so we're gonna continue that conversation with Milad here, but next time, hopefully we cross our fingers when we don't live in a restricted world because of pandemic. We are going to have you here in person, Stephanie, and have time to learn from you and have a conversation and hopefully about this book and your future publications. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And thanks to Milad for this very challenging intervention, which I
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Be safe.